Sarah spent 3 hours getting ready for their anniversary dinner. She wore the black dress David had once said made her look like Audrey Hepburn, paired with the pearl earrings he'd given her on their 10th anniversary. Lorenzo's had been their special place since their first date. The same corner table, the same red wine, the same tiramisu they always shared despite promising to try something new. Her phone buzzed at 7:15 p.m. Emma's having panic attacks. She keeps saying she remembers something bad. I can't leave her like this. The text was followed by a brief, sorry, as if 2 syllables could patch the growing void in their marriage. Sarah sat alone at their table, watching other couples feed each other bites of pasta, their laughter a melody that scraped against her raw nerves. The hospital corridor felt longer than usual as Sarah walked toward Emma's room, her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the floor. Through the window, she saw them. David sitting on Emma's bed, one arm around her shoulders as she leaned into him, both giggling over a piece of chocolate cake. Emma was wearing his Northwestern sweatshirt, the one Sarah had bought him last Christmas. I remember our first kiss, Emma was saying, her voice carrying through the partially open door. Behind the bleachers after you won the championship game. You tasted like Gatorade and victory. David laughed, the rich, genuine sound Sarah hadn't heard in months. Blue raspberry, he added. Coach always stocked the blue ones because they matched our uniforms. Sarah's hand tightened around her anniversary gift, a first edition of David's favorite novel, the one he'd been hunting for years. The book's corners dug into her palm as she watched her husband live out someone else's love story. At home, Sarah moved through their bedroom like a tornado of quiet fury. She pulled David's precisely organized shirts from the hangers, folded them with the same care he always used, and placed them in his favorite leather suitcase. Their wedding album sat on the bedside table. She tucked it between his sweaters, a time capsule of promises that had aged like milk. The divorce papers had been sitting in her desk drawer for a week. Her lawyer had called them insurance, but now they felt more like prophecy. She arranged them on David's pillow, beside a letter she'd rewritten 17 times. I used to think love was about grand gestures and destined meetings. Now I know it's about choices. The daily decision to stay, to grow, to face reality together. You're choosing a memory, David, a perfect, preserved moment that can't possibly survive in the real world. I refuse to compete with the ghost of who you were at 18. When you read this, you'll either realize what you're throwing away, or you'll keep chasing your reflection in Emma's eyes. Either way, I'm choosing myself. I'm choosing a life where I'm not the footnote in someone else's love story. The girl you loved at 18 doesn't exist anymore. Neither does the boy who loved her. But I exist, David. I'm real, I'm here. And I deserve someone who chooses me in the present, not someone who's trying to rewrite their past. Sarah placed his house key on top of the letter, the metal still warm from her grip. As she stepped back, her heel caught on something under the bed, David's old yearbook, open to the page where Emma had written, "Forever yours." Sarah closed it with a quiet snap. Some fervors, she realized, were meant to end. The day Emma woke up, Sarah was in the hospital cafeteria, picking at a dry turkey sandwich. A commotion erupted upstairs, running feet, excited voices, the squeaking of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. By the time she reached Emma's room, David was already there, tears streaming down his face as he clutched Emma's hand. The teenage girl trapped in a 33-year-old's body smiled up at him with unconcealed adoration. "David, you cut your hair," Emma said, frowning slightly as she reached up to touch his temple. "I liked it longer, remember? Like Brad Pitt in Fight Club." Her voice was scratchy from weeks of intubation, but the flirtatious lilt remained unchanged. Sarah watched her husband's face transform, the years melting away as he slipped seamlessly into his 18-year-old self. The neurologist explained it during a family conference. Selective retrograde amnesia, a condition where the brain builds walls around specific periods of memory. Emma's mind had erected a fortress around the last 15 years, protecting itself from trauma by retreating to a time when life felt safest, a time when David was hers. It's temporary, the doctor assured them. Most patients regain their memories gradually. But Sarah noticed how David's shoulders relaxed at the word most, as if uncertainty was a gift he hadn't dared hope for. The lies started small. David removed his wedding ring, explaining to Sarah that it would be medically irresponsible to shock Emma's system. He began bringing Emma her favorite high school snacks, Sour Patch Kids and Cherry Coke, the exact brands they'd shared during study hall. When Emma asked about his life, he spoke in careful vagaries, describing his job as an accountant, but omitting the promotions Sarah had celebrated with him just last month. Sarah found herself becoming a ghost in her own marriage, haunting the periphery of conversations that always seemed to end when she entered a room. She discovered David's old Letterman jacket missing from their storage closet, only to see it draped over Emma's hospital bed the next day. She was cold, David explained, not meeting her eyes. The hospital staff began treating David like Emma's boyfriend, sharing knowing smiles when he arrived with her favorite chocolate milkshake from the diner they'd frequented in high school. Nobody seemed to notice or care about the wedding ring-shaped tan line on his finger or the wife who sat in the waiting room, watching her marriage dissolve like sugar in rain. One evening, Sarah overheard Emma asking David about their prom night. "You promised we'd dance to that song at our wedding," Emma said dreamily. David's response was lost in the hospital's ambient noise, but his guilty glance toward the door where Sarah stood told her everything she needed to know. Her husband wasn't just visiting the past, he was moving back in, leaving their present to collect dust like the dinner plates that sat untouched in their kitchen cabinet at home. Sarah spent that first night alone in the king-size bed, watching shadows dance across the ceiling as emergency vehicles wailed in the distance. Each siren made her wonder if David was still at the hospital, still holding Emma's hand, still trying to process how a routine Tuesday evening had shattered into chaos. The accident report arrived in David's email the next morning. Sarah saw it pop up while making coffee. A drunk driver had run a red light, T-boning Emma's sedan with enough force to flip it twice. The responding officer noted that if Emma hadn't swerved at the last second, she would have died instantly. Instead, she lay suspended between life and death, with tubes breathing for her and machines tracking every flutter of her damaged heart. David's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He called their mutual friends, not for support, but to gather stories about Emma from their high school days. Sarah found him at 3 a.m. in their home office, surrounded by yearbooks he'd dug out of storage. His fingers traced teenage Emma's face in prom photos, in cheerleading shots, in candid moments where she and David looked at each other like they held the secrets to the universe. "I promised her father I'd look after her," David explained when Sarah questioned his obsession. "Before he died last year, I promised him." But Sarah remembered that conversation differently. A casual moment at a neighborhood barbecue where Emma's elderly father had joked about David being the son he never had. Now David was transforming that simple exchange into a death vow. The hospital staff began to recognize Sarah, but not as David's wife. "Are you Emma's friend?" they'd ask, while David sat in the ICU waiting room, clutching Emma's favorite plush dolphin from their senior trip to SeaWorld. Sarah started wearing brighter lipstick, styling her hair, arriving with homemade casseroles. Anything to remind the world, to remind David, that she was the wife, not the sympathetic friend. 2 weeks into the coma, David missed their nephew's birthday party. Sarah sat alone at the family gathering, fielding awkward questions about her husband's absence. Later that night, she found David asleep in the hospital chapel, an old mix CD from his teenage years with Emma clutched to his chest. The track list was still legible. "Forever Young," "Time After Time," "Never Tear Us Apart," a teenage promise of eternal love now serving as a haunting prophecy. Sarah realized then that she wasn't just competing with Emma's present condition. She was fighting against the golden perfection of first love, preserved in amber and now threatening to crack open, spilling its sweet poison into her marriage. As she watched David stir in his sleep, murmuring Emma's name, Sarah wondered if some accidents destroyed more than just bodies. Sometimes they shattered the careful illusions that kept marriages intact, revealing the hairline fractures that had been there all along. 6 months felt like both a lifetime and a blink. Sarah sat in her new apartment, surrounded by moving boxes labeled "mine," a word that had become both a wound and a declaration of independence. The morning paper lay open on her coffee table, folded to the society section where Emma's engagement announcement should have been. Instead, there was only empty space, much like the void David had tried to fill with memories. Emma's recovery had been dramatic, but not in the way David had hoped. Her memories returned like a tsunami, violent, overwhelming, and destructive. She remembered her successful marketing career, her 2-year relationship with a kind pediatrician, and most devastatingly, the truth about her breakup with David. "We were kids," she had reportedly screamed at him in the hospital corridor. "We broke up because we wanted different lives. How dare you try to make me live in a lie?" Sarah heard about it all from their mutual friend Jessica, who worked as a nurse at Memorial. David had shown up at Emma's room one last time, clutching their old prom photos. Emma had thrown them back at him, each picture a rejection of the fantasy he tried to rebuild. "I didn't lose my life," she had said. "I lost a few years of memories. But you lost your integrity, your marriage, and any chance of us even being friends." The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, just like the accident that had started it all. Sarah's lawyer, Michael, delivered them personally. He was different from David in every way, pragmatic where David had been romantic, present where David had been lost in the past. When he asked her to dinner, Sarah surprised herself by saying yes. Their first date was at a new restaurant, not Lorenzo's. Michael ordered bourbon, not red wine. He listened as Sarah talked about her plans to open her own art gallery, something David had always called impractical. When Michael smiled, it didn't remind her of anyone else. It was just him, genuine and uncomplicated. Sarah ran into David at the supermarket a week later. He was buying frozen dinners and instant coffee, looking older than his 35 years. His shopping basket held none of the organic products she had always insisted on, none of the specialty items Emma had loved. He was shopping for one, just like she had been all those nights he'd spent at the hospital. "I chose wrong," he said quietly, staring at the freezer case. "I chose a memory over a future." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and felt the last pieces of her anger melt away. "No," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You chose who you really were, and so did I." That evening, Sarah added one final item to her journal of life lessons. Sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted leads you to everything you actually need. She closed the book and got ready for her date with Michael. Her black dress hung in the closet, unworn. Tonight, she'd wear red. After all, it wasn't about rewriting the past anymore. It was about coloring the future in shades she chose for herself.